Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first in this autumn series of urban living webinars. Today, we are focusing on the build-to-rent sector and how the market can overcome the obstacles in its way to adding new inventory. My name is George Sell. I'm editor of Urban Living News, and we are an online B2B platform for the living sector. Today's webinar is going to last an hour. We'd like to make it as interactive as possible, so if you've got any questions, then please submit them using the Q&A or the chat function in Zoom, and we'll get around to answering them either at the time or we'll save a few minutes at the end of the session. And a link to a recording of the session will be emailed to everybody who is registered. Now, this webinar is sponsored by Abode Worldwide, and we're just going to watch a short video to find out a bit more about them. Okay, so thanks to Abode Worldwide for sponsoring. If you look in the chat, you can see some contact details for them, so please do get in touch. I just wanted to show a few screen grabs from stories that we've run on Urban Living News over the last few months to give today's discussion a bit of context. So the first one's the bad news. There's some numbers there which aren't particularly inspiring. UK build-to-rent investment down over 40% year on year for Q2. Construction starts also down across the whole piece. Build-to-rent is included in that. And then we've seen developers having a bit of a tough time, such as Watkin Jones, which had to issue a profit warning. But if we go to the next slide, there are still some good things happening. So the big institutional investments are still coming into the sector, such as the Aviva and the Moda 400 million deal there. Development finance is tough, but it is out there. So Canary Wharf Group secured 535 million for Wood Wharf, and Goodstone Living 100 million for a modular scheme in Birmingham. And also on the plus side, demand is really high. You see Granger there has got 98.7% occupancy across its portfolio. And despite some of the challenges, buildings are being delivered on time, or in some cases ahead of schedule, as with the Salford scheme there. And completions are up for this year, although we anticipate that to slow. But compared with other areas of the construction market, build to rent is in a pretty good place. So we've got a fantastic panel to help us through the discussion today. I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves. Stephanie, I'd like to start with you, please. Good afternoon. Can you tell us a bit about what you do at Hubbl?
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me today. So I joined Hubbl a few months ago as head of living sector operations, and Hubbl itself is an end-to-end advisory group, starting from the capital partnership, doing viability, feasibility views into different assets and opportunities, all the way through design, fit out, FF&E, and well into the asset management and operations view, being able to partner up with some really fantastic clients across the UK and Ireland. And prior to that, I have had over 20 years of experience in build to rent, multifamily, and the sub 10 years underneath that across single family, student as well as senior living across both North America as well as Europe. So it's been really exciting to watch the market evolve and looking forward to speaking with my esteemed peers today about the market here in the UK.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephanie. Let's go to Gary next. Gary, good afternoon to you.
Oh, hi there. So I'm Gary McLuskey. I'm an architect. I'm the global head of design for Greystar. We're a vertically integrated business from investment, asset management, portfolio management, construction, development, design, and operations. And we are in 17 different countries at the moment, with over 1 million, I think maybe close to 1 million apartments. And my background, I'm an architect. I worked with designing social housing for about 10 years, and then 10 years in for sale housing, and then 10 years in build to rent housing.
Excellent. Thanks, Gary. Max, welcome to you.
Thanks, George, and afternoon, everyone. I'm Max Sugden. I am Transactions Director here at Telford Homes. Telford are a leading developer of residential-led communities in London and the UK. To date, we have delivered over 15,000 units since we began in 2000. Our build-to-rent journey started back in 2016 when we delivered our first scheme for L&Q in North London. And since then, we have either delivered or are currently on site with 12 other build-to-rent schemes for various capital partners. And we're a member of Trammell Crow Company, which is a global real estate developer, 100% owned by CBRE. And a big focus for us is sustainable development. And we're lucky enough to have been nominated as the most sustainable home builder for the last 3 years by NextGen.
Excellent. Thank you, Max. I think Andrew's having a bit of trouble joining us. I don't think he's there. Andrew, are you with us? No. Okay. So we'll crack on. If you look in the chat, you can see the LinkedIn profiles for our speakers. So please do get in touch with them after the webinar and carry on the conversation. So the session's called Overcoming the Obstacles. And let's start by talking about some of the obstacles, and we'll begin with planning, which is always a bit of a hot potato, but let's see how we get on. Max, can I start with you? How consistent is planning policy towards build to rent nationally? How much does it vary? I mean, I know you're predominantly in London and the southeast, but you know that planning policies can vary from borough to borough. Is that the case with build to rent?
They can indeed, George. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, our focus to date has been London, and so we have limited experience outside of London, but I know that the same challenges occur there that we have with London boroughs. I think for us, the key is a lack of consistency amongst the boroughs, not only in terms of their approach to key topics like height, scale and massing and affordable housing, but also in their actual ways of working with us and how they want to interact. I think, we do find that differs. And, we continue to face challenges with kind of London boroughs where the same topics are coming up. The use of DMR, I think most people on the call will be familiar with, but we're still finding working with some boroughs that they don't accept that as a true form of affordable tenure. And when we're trying to deliver build-to-rent communities that can be delivered to essentially one investment partner, that obviously creates challenges as well. So it comes back to that consistency part, and unfortunately, we're not quite there yet with all the London boroughs that we work with.
Do you think the situation is improving? I mean, obviously, we've got a lobbying body in the shape of the UKA and various other organisations. Do you think progress is being made?
I think so. I think by nature of the fact that this sector has been an institutional asset class for really a decade plus now, and I think there's a lot of very good examples of build to rent adding a lot of value to communities. And I think London boroughs are recognising that, and actually there are a number who are very proactive and are working with us through the challenges that we're facing at the moment in multiple different ways to try and help us. So I certainly think we are, George, but I think there's still a little way to go.
And Gary, at Greystar, you're obviously dealing with not just local authorities in this country, but across Europe and beyond. But focusing on the UK, how are you finding the planning system to deal with?
I think we've taken a massive step backwards, and I think when I was doing sort of for sale housing before Greystar, maybe 10 years ago, you know, the London Housing Design Guide had been developed by a sort of group within the GLA and external architects. And one of the things that it said was that it should never become the rule. It should always be guidance. I mean, the hint is in the name, Housing Design Guide. And I think in the first pages, it actually says that. And what's happened is that has become a kind of a rule book rather than guidance now. And I remember back when we were doing our Greenford project, which is 2,000 apartments out in West London. And, you know, I think 6 meetings with the GLA to explain the difference between for sale housing, social housing, and build to rent, with the fundamental thing being the management strategy and the long-term investment. And the GLA at that time got it, they understood, and they issued a guidance note relaxing some of the requirements of the London Housing Design Guide. That was scrapped a couple of years ago. And now every time we go in for a discussion, we have to kind of explain ourselves with every local authority. And it just makes it incredibly difficult for the local authorities to get on board, because now that guidance has become law and sort of unpicks all of the amazing work that we did back in 2015, you know, from 2014 to 2016 with the GLA. And it was amazing because we had the Deputy Mayor out at Greenford last week, and he loved the entire scheme. And to deliver that scheme, we would have to go and battle the GLA again and all of the local authorities, you know, and the local authorities' hands are kind of tied really as soon as the London Housing Design Guide became, you know, an integral part of, you know, the London plan, without the flexibility to actually develop what people want. Because, I mean, we have a research team who specialize in sort of polling all of our residents to understand, you know, what it is that, you know, they want. And so we have a massive amount of data and a massive amount of knowledge on, you know, what works best for a community. And there's no correlation between what residents want and what's in the London Housing Design Guide. And so it causes us huge problems, you know. And I think, I don't know what we can do to kind of, you know, recover where we were, you know, 8 years ago.
Interesting enough, I was at Greenford yesterday, and
Oh yeah,
yeah, it was quite interesting to see the difference between the first 2 phases and how you've refined those according to residents' needs. Anyway, I liked it a lot. I was impressed. Stephanie, we, you know, if we look at the role of planning in and how it may be challenging the delivery of new inventory, we've got to look at this new second staircase rule, which has really been a spanner in the works for quite a few schemes. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, of course. And I think, you know, as with planning, as with a lot of the kind of policies that are coming forward, whether we're talking about building safety, we're talking about rent reforms, you know, there's not necessarily loads of clear guidance as of yet. And it's almost like it's kind of shaping as it's taking hold, and then it pivots and changes. Even if you think EWS1 form, so the external wall configurations and all of those different pieces, we need to have some clear guidance from the planners. But again, this takes an understanding of the market. And I think that what we've really seen is that there's a clear lack of understanding of what build to rent is, along with single family homes in, you know, kind of a build to rent subsector within the councils and the government. So if you think about it, you combine the planning spending falling 14.6% over a 12-year period when the housing crisis just became even more prevalent. It's consistently caused delays, issues with recruitment, staff shortages, in many of the authorities across the nation. And then you add to that having 12 different housing ministers in 10 years, which has to be some sort of global record. How can the government, and I don't want this to be a government bashing thing, I think it's just a matter of also thinking about how do we work with them to actually get housing as a true priority, raising the profile so that it's a desirable role to be a housing minister rather than seen as a troublesome stepping stone. If we're going to get any consistency and understanding, especially with the looming rent reforms in the upcoming years, we need to be able to work with the government, and preferably one who gets it as a solution to the wider house building issues. Whether we're talking about the second staircase and getting very clear guidance on the expectations about that, whether we're talking about even, are we going to have rolling contracts? Are we going to have a standard, kind of minimum 12-month like we do in Germany and in Denmark and over in the Netherlands before it goes to rolling contracts, rent caps? I think that unfortunately in any country, it's very easy to toss things out like rent reforms without thinking about actually the core issue. Rent reforms won't fix it. The core issue is you have to have stock. And to have stock, you have to have clear planning. Even thinking about planning, thinking about licensing. Licensing is not even clear sometimes within the same city. And that causes a lot of issues, especially when you are thinking about developing, which then can also hinder people being willing to take that planning risk. So that's why we do tend to still see this forward funding, forward commitment approach within the investment world. I think we all need to do a little bit of work. I think Ben Beadle, UKA, the groups are doing some great lobbying, but there's still a way to go.
As Max alluded to earlier, build to rent's been an institutional investment asset class for 10 years. So the lack of government understanding is astonishing, really. But when the housing minister's job tenure is shorter than your average football manager, it's hardly a surprise. One area where, sorry, please go ahead, Gary.
No, I was just going to add. The staircase thing has caused complete chaos. I think I'd heard sort of not indirectly that there's been a massive drop in planning applications as people start trying to figure it out. There isn't clear guidance. When you look at the guidance for the design of the two core fire escape stair and lift arrangement, it's very difficult to actually plan a building that works with two fire escape stairs and two lifts in the configuration that's outlined in the documents. You end up with lifts kind of remote from each other. So you're pressing the button on one and then running over to the other if it arrives. So there's a sort of lack of clarity, I think, within the document. And then you get, the GLA and the fire authority giving two different messages. And for us, it's a complete nightmare, because we need to be able to go forward with projects. We need some level of certainty for the investor to make sure that project is going to happen. And we've embraced the two staircase approach. UK was very unique. Globally, two staircases is the norm. And so we were always very unique, and I think it's a good thing. But if you compare our guidance on the two staircases to maybe guidance in the Netherlands or guidance in the US, they're quite different, And I don't know what is going to come of the consultation and what's finally going to arrive, but it sort of creates chaos in the market.
Yeah, it's a muddle, like
a
lot of things. Another issue affecting delivery is cost. Cost of materials has gone up, cost of development finance has gone up. Max, how badly is the current inflationary environment slowing down delivery of pipelines, do you think?
Well, I think undoubtedly it is, and it's felt in different ways. You alluded to cost price inflation affecting development side of things. We've certainly felt that over the last 12 to 18 months. I think I was actually talking to our construction team yesterday, you know, we're starting to feel it cooling a little bit, but cooling doesn't mean that prices are going down. It just means that the rate of inflation is not quite as high as it was before. And, you know, when you then bring in the revenue effects that we've had with yields moving out, with the debt not really being accretive to projects, I think it's really hard to make things stack at the moment. And the only real lever to pull is really land values, and we know how sticky those can be. So there's not a lot of positive inputs in the appraisal at the moment. The one saving grace would probably be the rental side of things, and the resilience of the sector, I think, has been phenomenal. You referenced Granger's occupancy levels there. That's been seen across I think the market generally, and there's been some really strong rental growth. So, you know, that helps, but it doesn't outweigh the multiple headwinds that we're facing as a result of the inflationary environment.
Gary, is your pipeline and the speed at which you can deliver it, has that been affected?
It's interesting. I mean, we did quite a few large projects. You know, we acquired the Bermondsey site sort of maybe a year ago, and so our pipeline's actually quite full. But that doesn't mean to say that it's not challenging, because inflation affects everything. You know, it affects massively the affordability side of things for renters, particularly in the shadow market where mortgages have gone up hugely, and you know, the sort of individual landlords are really struggling, and so you see rent inflation there, and then our costs have gone up. You know, the cost of debt and the cost of construction have gone up massively, and so you're having to work very hard to make deals stack, and you know, there hasn't really been a adjustment in land value to offset it. And so, you know, it's probably the most challenging time right now. I mean, the bigger fear, I think, is what happened back in sort of 2008 and construction companies going under. You know, that's probably the biggest fear, you know, when you get the kind of inflation in costs happening midway through a project that a contractor has priced maybe a year, 2 years ago. And they're getting really, really badly hit.
Yeah. Stephanie, are land values being affected by inflation as much as everything else, or are they remaining fairly stable?
Land values definitely escalating. I think that, you know, when you take a look at, as Gary said, when you look at debt, when you look at the land costs right now, especially in certain areas, because a lot of groups are vying for the same land, let's be very honest. And, you know, I think that this is where there's really an opportunity to think about how we broaden. If we look at other countries, you know, if we think of US, Canada, Germany, Nordics, there are a much more diverse approach on housing. It's not all just city center based. And, you know, there are single family homes, there are garden style communities, and you can tend to access land that's a little bit more affordable. You know, if I even think my own backyard, I live up in Milton Keynes, and obviously we've had a massive boom of build to rent, which has flown off the shelf. It's been a huge, huge success up here, but it is really a huge opportunity to think about, you know, the garden style communities, potentially even mixed tenures. So maybe it is the, you know, you've got townhomes alongside apartments, and you've got a bit of retail there as well. So a bit more of a placemaking type of approach. Also opportunity to think about, you know, I mean, senior living right now, if you think about how many homes are underoccupied, and I'm not saying kick seniors out of their homes. What I am saying is there are seniors who want to downsize, but they don't have viable living quarters for them to move into. They might not necessarily need a care home. You know, there's only about 80,000 purpose-built stock in the UK. And most of that is sell product. And if you think about it, we have over 12 million seniors. So how do we open up some of that potential to sell homes? How do we, you know, get people on that property ladder? But also, how do we make sure that for those retirees who want to get into potentially intergenerational living, build to rent, they really want that kind of access to local amenity, whatnot. You know, how do we actually approach that? And also, as I said, in kind of some of maybe these more tertiary areas, if you will, and build these small communities. So I think there's some huge opportunity if we start thinking outside of the box a little bit more and looking to other countries to really learn from them.
Mhm. And staying with you for a moment, Stephanie, as somebody who until relatively recently was working for an investment house, is investor sentiment towards build to rent as strong as it has ever been, or is it waning in the face of the current challenges?
There is still definitely interest in it. I think that anytime you start to see a difficult economic stance, you start to see redemptions being called in, potential rebalancing in the face of economic adversity, yields moving out, and all of these different things adding up, debt concerns and whatnot. You're going to see a slowdown, but it will pick back up. It's just a matter of also thinking about, if companies are potentially becoming more risk averse as far as the development side of things, we will start to see some of this, first generation build to rent coming to market. They're coming up for refi. Some of them won't be able to be refinanced because of current market opportunities. And so it's really the chance to take a look at those and think about, how do we do that from a value add some stability to our portfolios by actually having stabilized income generating properties to balance out some of that risk. So I don't think that the hunger has gone away. I think that maybe there's a slowdown, or people kind of waiting and watching. I do think that there is a huge opportunity to also tap into private equity here, because in market conditions like this is where private equity can really tend to get in and maybe be a little bit more nimble than some of the big investment houses who have very traditional kind of approach. Sometimes they have very strict rules on, we don't do planning risk, we don't, we want to do forward funding only, so on and so forth. And those private equity houses sometimes are willing to maybe take a little bit more of that because they have that longer view for a hold.
And are you starting to see that yet, this kind of broadening of the investor pool, or do you think this is something that might be just around the corner?
Absolutely seeing it. In fact, I just had a conversation with a high profile client, private equity firm, who was very much taking a look at it. And actually, rather than looking at, no, we want only buildings that are 250 units or more, has to be London city center, so on and so forth, they're like, actually, we're open to different areas. We're actually open to different types of communities. So whether that is, serviced apartments, single family, it could be senior living, boutique style, as well as, yes, maybe there is some placemaking opportunity, especially for some of these wider scale programs that councils are trying to push forward to really regenerate the different areas. I think we're definitely seeing that. I think we need to absolutely tap into that resource.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Stephanie. Max, let's just go back to the development finance piece a moment. You mentioned earlier that inflation is slowing. It's still high, but it's slowing. Are development finance terms starting to improve? Or are you seeing a bit of light on the horizon there?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say, there's a huge amount of interest from debt providers in working in this space. Clearly, their activity has reduced significantly over the recent period, and in our interactions with them, and anecdotally, they're as keen as ever to be providing development finance or other finance for build to rent assets if they're operational as well. I guess it goes back to that point around the intrinsic SONIA rates and the Bank of England rate at the moment, and even at competitive margins on top, which we're seeing, your all-in cost is close to double digits. And if you're at that level, you're not going to be particularly accretive to your, when you're trying to boost your IRR and other metrics. What it does is it enables your equity commitment to come down significantly, but you're doing it at a considerable cost. So I think it's challenging at the moment. I think in the next 12 to 18 months, the forecast would suggest that SONIA will come in a bit, and therefore I think debt will become more accretive. And there's certainly a lot of debt capital out there that wants to be deployed. The resilience and the fundamentals of the sector remain as strong as ever, I think, from their perspective. So it's ready to go. It's just not quite financially helping in the way it would have done a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. And Gary, in terms of the investor profile, are you seeing new interest from investors in getting behind Greystar projects, or is it a kind of core that tends to come back over and over again?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to only really work with institutional investors. I mean, where we're seeing private equity interest is in distressed markets. San Francisco at the moment is probably one of the worst and but the rest of our investors are still, the markets are moving in different directions, and they're keeping an eye on that. And I think London has always been a strong market for them.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Steph, do you think we're getting to the stage yet where the market is mature enough for some of the actual operating platforms to be trading, to be changing hands on a regular basis?
I don't think completely. I think that over the next coming years, we might start to see some merges. I mean, we're just still starting to see some new companies that are forming. They're expanding their businesses. They're kind of moving from traditional estate and lettings and adding the build to rent full operations piece onto the business. And there are also others that are newer. They're not completely nascent, but they're newer, and they're still trying to create their own identities. So I don't know if we'll necessarily see a big scale of that by any means. Nothing like, and Gary will know full well, the way that Greystar really grew was through a lot of acquisitions, whether you're looking at, kind of some of the different businesses that they acquired through the years, Omni Properties, Trammell Crow, groups like that back in the States. And I don't think our market is quite at that point yet, to be completely honest. But I do think that we are starting to see a better caliber coming out and a better understanding of creating operational efficiencies and consistencies in the market, which is a great sign.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Stephanie. Let's talk a bit about the customers and who they are, and how that's changing, and perhaps how the market, the sector can attract new customers. Gary, as your offer has kind of evolved in this country, are you seeing a broader demographic profile coming in as the resident?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we cover everything from student to urban living, which is our name for co-living, to conventional senior housing. We've launched an affordable product in the US that we're not seeking any funding from government to deliver. So we cover a really broad range of product. And in the conventional housing, I think the core demographic is 24 to 40. There's a lot of people now sort of unmarried until the kind of late 30s, and there's a lot of there's a lot of couples and singles living in our properties. Not so much families. I think families tend to move out of the city, to sort of larger places, and whoever's the working parent is the one who has to suffer the commute in order to gain that space. But we do have some cohorts of families, but it's generally sort of couples and singles. And we have seen a change in rent profile where a lot of couples are taking 2-bedroom apartments rather than 1-beds because they've got work from home, and even to a certain extent 3-bed apartments. And so we have seen some shifts just in how the workplace has evolved.
Max, how about you? How has your customer base changed?
Well, I think for us at the moment, George, we're kind of handing on buildings to investors who are then leasing up themselves. So we only hear stories anecdotally from them. But if I think back to my time at Grainger, I remember we had a scheme in Barking in the kind of mid-teens, and the profile was broadly as Gary set out, but there was a tenant as old as 63, I think he was at the time. And I think it was one of the surprises for us back then that actually you were getting a broad range of tenants who were keen to let, not just that mainstream kind of 20s to early 30s. So what I think actually the sector does quite well and perhaps doesn't get credit for is there is a lot of range in offering. I think with the different investors and the different product out there, you have the higher end of the market that I think get a lot of attention in the press, and rightly so. They do a very good job and have some very good amenities and specifications and the like. But actually, there's another end of the market at the kind of lower to mid levels, which also serve a very good purpose for a lot of the rental population who are perhaps looking to pay less, but as a result have less amenities and maybe less prime locations, for example. So I think we actually do a pretty good job in doing that, and perhaps that end of the market don't always get the same spotlight as others do.
Mm. And do you sense that we've maybe reached a tipping point in this country in the last year or two due to a number of factors with regards people's attitudes to renting versus home ownership? I mean, with mortgage rates going up, it's accelerated the process. But do you think people are more comfortable with renting for longer now than they used to be? And is that having a positive effect on the build to rent market?
If I think about my cohort as kind of early 30s and what I've seen of my friends and family, I think they are, but I think fundamentally, and whether this is because of the rhetoric you get from a political level or upbringing, whatever it might be, people fundamentally do want to own, and I still think there's that ambition for a lot of people, but I do think it is changing. I think it is people for lifestyle reasons are renting and build to rent, not just because of affordability. And I think with what we've been able to do as a sector over the last decade or so, we've given people that option, and they've decided they want that flexibility. In a more transient world that I think we find ourselves in more and more, I think the not being tied down to a mortgage and a home somewhere gives people that flexibility in their lifestyle that people are more and more seeking. So I think it has improved, George. But at the same time, I do think fundamentally home ownership remains a big thing for this country.
Yeah, I met someone last week for the first time who had sold their house in the mid-50s. They'd sold their house and moved into a rental property, like a purpose-built rental property, and that's the first time I met someone who's gone the other direction. So I think attitudes are definitely changing. In the mortgage market at the moment, I mean, you were 0.5% on a mortgage, maybe 5 years ago, and you're now at 6%. It's quite a significant difference.
Well, and with the cost of living, it makes it harder and harder to obviously save up for that deposit. And, especially when we think about, even just adding on going to the grocery store, deciding that you're going to go out. And the thing is, somebody can give up their Starbucks every day and they're still not going to have a down payment for a house. Let's be very, very honest here. So we need to start being, clever and making sure we're providing good quality homes. I mean, if we think about it, whenever we talk about demographics, I always kind of flash back. So one, to my US multifamily days, and I started many years ago, back in Colorado, and I had portfolios all across the country. And learn very quickly that yes, you might have certain demographics within certain buildings. You might lean more towards kind of the 25 to 30 or whatever. But actually, if we think about it, when I first moved here a little over 10 years ago, I still remember a conference that I went to, and everybody was talking about, oh, these are going to be geared towards, the 20 to 25-year-olds. It's all going to be shares. It's, nobody wants pets. Everybody just wants to walk in and go to their apartment and be left alone. And it's for the millennials. I think what they forgot is that millennials are turning 40. Millennials are 40 now. And 30 to 40, our lives change so much. And you know what? Actually, we do see families. I have one asset that was built that has about 34% family in it by the time we finished our lease up. At first, it was very much kind of singles, one bedrooms flew out the door, as they tend to do. But then we started seeing more and more families coming in. One of my very first properties that I launched here in the UK with a prior company down in Southampton, and everybody had said, oh, you know what, it's a furnished market, your rents are going to be too high, you're only going to get shares. Well, funny enough, we leased up the entire building unfurnished, did a remarkable speed. While we were optimizing rents as well. We weren't, pillaging, but we definitely were optimizing. Our first resident was a retiree who had retired, moved out to Devon with her husband. They got really bored after about a year and a half. And they're like, no, we want to be city center. We travel a lot, so they wanted to be closer to the airport. They sold their car, they moved in city center. And we had families in that community as well. And they almost became like adopted grandparents. And by the time I left that company, I was still going down there several days a week anyway. But, you know, all of these residents were coming together, all these different generations, and they were having community barbecues on a Thursday night, like a potluck type of approach, where everybody would come in and start building community. So I think that, you know, if we really think about opportunities here within our market, especially when we're talking about maybe getting to some of those tertiary areas, local areas that have a great economy themselves, but are also commutable, maybe to other city centers. You know, there's a huge opportunity here. I mean, we have what, over 45% of our population is over 45 years old. They still need homes, and some of those will not be able to necessarily buy. It could be because of lifestyle change. Maybe they're going through a divorce. Maybe they lost a partner. It could be that they go through empty nest syndrome and they don't want to have 4 bedrooms anymore because it's more cleaning and it's a pain in the butt, especially when you look at taxes. Only 8% is actually between that initial target range of 18 to 24 that everybody thought build to rent was going to be for. So again, this is where if we start thinking about these different tenures, we can really build value and start to, you know, actually solve or be a part of solving this housing issue.
Thanks, Steph. Some good points there. Gary, on the subject of attracting new customer groups and how you reach these people, we've got a good question coming here actually from Toby Healis. Thanks for your question, Toby. And he asks, are you investing in more visual assets like video or virtual tours to tell your property stories and attract the right customers? And are you trying to get more customers directly rather than through agencies? So what does Greystar do in that?
Yeah, it's interesting. In the US, we don't go through agencies because it's, you know, such a large business, and we have our own kind of route for residents to travel. I think internationally, as we move into new markets, we have to work closely with agents in order to help us sort of get momentum with residents. But we still have our own leasing teams who manage the process. And, you know, we're getting to scale now in the UK where, you know, people are starting to recognize our product. I think, what was the second part of the question?
Video virtual tour.
Yeah, I mean, COVID has changed everything. We started doing virtual tours almost as soon as COVID hit. We have keyless access to a lot of properties. We're implementing temporary keyless access, you know, so you can go over your property, and if it's empty, you can get access to the building and the amenity, wander around the property, go see the apartment if it's free. And so the whole nature of the kind of leasing path journey has changed in the last few years, as well as, you know, the virtual. There's the physical sort of non-accompanied leasing strategy. So yeah, we've seen a lot of changes.
And in terms of marketing, when I was touring Greenford yesterday, actually, they mentioned that there were a couple of influencers in one of the buildings, and that led to a conversation about how the kind of mid-20s and younger generation don't go to Rightmove when they're looking for property. They actually do consult social media as the kind of first step. So yeah. Have you got policy? You know, have you got a kind of strategy to address that and reach them?
Yeah, I mean, our teams run, you know, Instagram channels and, you know, TikToks and, you know, all the other stuff that I don't know very much about, in order to kind of generate interest. I mean, the other thing, I mean, we have, for example, at Greenford, we have lots of events, you know, that are tailored towards the entire community around the building. I mean, one of the things that really surprised us at Greenford was that a lot of the people who moved into the properties were from Greenford. And that really surprised us because we were expecting that, you know, we would probably get people moving either from further out, closer in, or closer in to further out. So, yeah, I mean, our marketing team work with every single strategy that is out there in order to kind of generate interest. And I still think young people do look on Rightmove.
Steph, did you want to come in on that one?
I would love to. This is something that I'm absolutely passionate about, is reaching different audiences. And I have to say, so first, you know, I saw some really remarkable things, actually from the Greystar team over on Coppermaker Square as well. So like utilizing the kiosks within the Stratford site, so people could do like kind of these immersive tours and visualizing themselves in the place and all of that. I do think that where, you know, there's some really smart marketing that you can do within the market. So, you know, for instance, linking in with Spotify, with Sky. You know, we had tremendous success on one of my past assets, which was managed by Appo, where we did a whole Sky campaign. The property ended up leasing 14 months before the underwrite was actually you know, projecting. And I think that that's absolutely phenomenal because they really leveraged the local ties to the community. They were using, obviously, as I mentioned, the Sky portion, the social media, a lot of word of mouth, you know, and then also thinking intelligently about how you use virtual tours. So virtual tours, I think, you know, we saw a boom in them, obviously, because of COVID. It was really a catalyst. They'd been around for a while before, but usually back in the States, I would use them more for, you know, like, okay, do we, you know, you live in California, I'm in Colorado, let me take you through the property. Are you near your computer? But actually that then evolved. And for instance, that asset that I mentioned down south in the UK, because we only had access to a couple of specific zones within the lease up, we were doing WhatsApp tours, hard hat WhatsApp tours, and taking people through their new apartment and things like that. And people really responded well to it. We had minimal cancellations or transfers to other unit types because we were able to utilize technology for it. During COVID, Copenhagen, typically a market where you do not use virtual tours, they embraced it. Our leasing agent was phenomenal. He was this absolutely charismatic gentleman. And at first he's like, I don't know how it'll take off. Tell me more about it. Set it up. And within just a couple weeks was going, I've got almost 100 followers now on Instagram and I'm doing these tours. And, you know, so it's really just about being maybe a little less afraid to try out some different things. There's nothing wrong with trying something and going, it didn't work in this market. I mean, I've had assets that were down the street and the demographic was so different that I needed to keep print ads on this property and not on that one, you know? So it's just about using the marketing spend, doing it, looking at your ROI and capturing that lead to lease information very closely, which Gary, I know your team do very well.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. Okay, well, let's go from the virtual to the physical and talk a bit about the actual product and how that might be changing. Gary, can you give us an overview on kind of how unit sizes, layouts, that kind of thing? What's the current thinking and how's that changing?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of every market we go into, you know, I'll go, you know, let's say visit apartments in Chile and look at what that market is like and look at the regulatory environment, and then our internal team develop those apartments for that market, and then we give those apartments to the architects to use. So we work within the sort of guidelines of London Plan for London in terms of unit sizes, and I think, you know, it was interesting. I think we've been in the student market for a long time, and that's a very well established market. That transitioned maybe 15 years ago from cluster apartment types to single studios, or from clusters to what they call studios, which is two people sharing a bathroom and a kitchen, to single studios. And then we've seen the kind of rise of co-living, and how that has started off by, you know, doing rooms which were 15 square meters, 16 square meters. And we have developed a product which starts at a minimum of 22 square meters and goes up to sort of 35. So it bridges that gap between the student sector and the, you know, the conventional sector, which I think is really interesting. And you know, the GLA are trying to kind of get their head around what that product is. And then in the conventional sector, you know, we're working with the 37 square meter studios and 50 square meter one beds. And we tend to stay around the 4-person, 2-bath, 2 beds, rather than the 1-bath, 3-bed units. But we are kind of you know, we do have a couple of schemes where those are quite popular. As people have moved from just renting a 1-bed, they don't want to scale up to a full 2-bed, 2-bath. And so that sort of 2-bed, 1-bath kind of is filling that niche, which I think is really interesting. And there are all sorts of things. I mean, the thing that is a big difference from when I did for sale housing to doing rental housing is storage. You know, we have a minimum standard in our business of 3 linear meters of storage in the master bedroom. That's it. If you go to any for sale development or really looking to, you know, forward purchase a deal, you're lucky sometimes you get 1.5 meters of linear storage. Now, I don't know how anybody could survive with that, you know, especially if they're living with a partner. You know, I think I've got about 0.5 meter of my own, but 4 meters in total. So it's, you know, there are certain significant differences from for sale to the rental because we're listening to what the residents are looking for. And we know that, you know, there are certain things that are really important. And we put breakfast bars in every apartment. We have enough space for dining tables and breakfast bars, just because we know that that's what people want. And so there's a lot of things that are different for maybe for sale. And I think the 2-bed dumbbell is very typical in the rental market. And I think that's there because you want to hedge your bets between sharers and families. But we have done some apartments with the back-to-back bedrooms, and it does kind of suit families better, to be honest.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Gary.
Yeah.
Max, I think there was maybe a few years ago in London, we saw something of an amenity arms race where each development coming out of the ground was trying to outdo its neighbour. Have we kind of reached a kind of leveling off now? And what would you say is the kind of standard level of amenities in a city centre build to rent scheme?
Well, I think it comes back to where you're pitching yourself in terms of offering. You know, that point we talked about earlier in terms of where you are in the market, whether you're, you know, low to mid market or whether you go higher end. And we've seen a number of different schemes come forward. Look, when we're looking at a piece of land and we're trying to ascertain what the right amount of amenity that goes into it, you know, we are spending a lot of time, you know, working with consultants and looking at the market fundamentals of what does that market really want, and actually really spending time talking to our investment partners on what are the amenities that have been successful for them in the past. Again, if I think back to my Granger days, we had a scheme in Canning Town, Argo Apartments. It had about 5,500 square feet opposite the station, and there was a kind of bedroom en suite that families could use if they went to come and see you know, one of their relatives who were living in the scheme. And actually the feedback was it wasn't particularly well used at the time, at least as much as one would expect, whereas the gym and the co-working space and other amenities really were. So is there a standard? I don't think so. I think it obviously depends exactly where you are and the offering you're trying to get to, but it feels to me that you know, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence out there and abilities to try and understand what the market wants that helps informs people like ourselves when we're understanding what we're going to deliver as part of one of our new schemes.
Do you think perhaps there's a case that if you're trying to get people into maybe secondary locations, I mean, some of the stuff I've seen in Wembley, which is got phenomenal amenities, the Greenford schemes yesterday have got fantastic amenities. Do you think you have to actually have more in a location like that than you would if you were in central London?
Yeah, it's a tricky one actually, because it is dependent on the product type. So I mean, we're having this debate at the moment in the US where we're doing a attainable product, which is low amenitized to keep the operational costs down, and single family, which again is low amenitized. And I think if you're in a central location with lots of buzz around it, maybe you can get away with a bit less amenity. And I think when you move to an area like Greenford, you probably need to put a little bit more in. But you've also got to, I mean, a big part of what we try and do is to integrate supportive retail into our projects as well. You know, so the ground floors are activated by cafes and bars and restaurants. But as a general guide, I think we have one rule for amenity, which not everyone follows outside of sort of Greystar, but the amenity goes in the best part of the building. That's the rule. You know, I've seen amenity put into basements and put in the worst part, the leftover pieces of the building. Our one rule is get the amenity in the best part of the building because everybody benefits from it. So it's a much more kind of democratic approach to amenity. So you see at Greenford, it's all rooftop amenity, you know, lots of amenity on the ground floor, on the podiums. And so, yeah, I think that really makes a difference, you know, to the overall quality of life, especially if you're living in a studio apartment and you got your friends coming over, and then suddenly you can take them to a penthouse kind of lifestyle at the roof level. And we're just launching Bloom this week. The amenities have just opened, and we've got an outdoor pool on the roof and all sorts of amenities going on there. Our kind of rule of thumb is around 3 square meters per apartment. And you'll find that as you go down the scale from conventional to urban living to student, 3 meters per apartment holds because you're increasing the number of units and you're obviously increasing the number of apartments. So as a kind of general rule of thumb, we sit around that.
But it definitely does need to be balanced with the demographic and the interest within that community. I mean, I launched an asset that very first thing was, okay, well, where are we going to put the gym? And actually, you walk out the door and you have literally 5 gyms within a 10-minute walking distance, plus yoga studios as well. And so it didn't make any sense. We were like, let's leverage that space then that we were going to put the gym into and create some really valuable kind of flex space for the residents to use where, yes, we can still host a HIIT class. We can still have yoga. We can do a wine and cheese. We can do a planting day, whatever the case may be in those zones, but then tap into the greater community. And I think that's something that we definitely need to think about, especially as we're messaging out to the councils. Our buildings aren't meant to just be insular. So, you know, we can talk about amenity. Absolutely. It has to be balanced out. You know, it has to be thought and also not eat too much of your OpEx up because obviously NOI needs to be viable, but also how are we feeding into the local community? How are we tapping into local businesses? Do we have a flex space where the local barista can come and, you know, I mean, if I think of the Apple Barking site, when they were doing their lease up and people were first moving in, they had a mobile barista come, still comes, did a fantastic job, absolutely loved it. The residents all absolutely had a blast with it. You know, and sometimes you also phase your amenities. Sometimes, so for instance, on a Sutton asset that we launched, we waited to do our amenity until a little bit later because we purchased the second tower and we knew that we needed to create some really impactful individual use spaces. So knowing that we actually did have families, especially a lot of single parents in that area, we had a playground put on one of the roof terraces. We did have a kids room that was set up where you could host an after school homework club. You know, and then of course we did also have the gym and so on and so forth. But it's again about tailoring it to your building as opposed to just getting caught up in a big amenity race. Some of great portfolios really don't have any amenity at all except for maybe a nice garden. But they're tapping into that local community.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie. We've reached 3 o'clock. We could go on for a lot longer. I think there's a lot to get our teeth into in this subject, but we've got to cut it off here, I'm afraid. Thanks so much to Max, to Gary, and to Stephanie for their insights today. I'm just going to show a couple more slides before we wrap up. There's also quite a lot of info in the chat, so we're going to leave the session open for a couple of minutes so you can take some notes of some of the info in there. So the next Urban Living webinar is an intriguing one. It's about AI and Web3. What does it mean for real estate? I have to admit, I am still very much getting my head around this one, and I don't think I'm alone in that. So that should be an interesting one. That's on October the 11th, and the link to register for that is in the chat. Next week, we have an in-person event, and it's based around the flex office space, new ways of working, how that whole market is evolving, and it's at Office Space in Town on the 20th. If you would like tickets for that, again, the link is in the chat. And another event, I'm happy to say that post-pandemic we are getting more and more into overseas events. We used to do quite a few before the pandemic, and we're going back to Dubai for the first time in November for the Urban Living Festival MEA. Again, the link is in the chat. That should be a good one. Look forward to seeing some of you out there. If you're interested in working with us at IHM, either with our digital offer or our in-person events, get in touch with one of my colleagues, Jordan or Piers. You can see their contact details there and again in the chat. And finally, thanks very much for joining us. Thanks again to our speakers. Thanks to Abode Worldwide for sponsoring, and thanks to you all for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.